Okay, today I'll be teaching you how to solve a quadratic equation using the quadratic formula. Now, throughout these lessons so far, I've been teaching you how to find the zeros, either by factoring or by graphing. There's another way to do this, and it's called using the quadratic formula. If you take this formula right here and you apply it correctly, it will tell you the two places that your graph crosses the x-axis. So when you fill out this formula, it will give you the 2 points that it crosses the x-axis. Now the math behind it, why this formula works, actually goes back to standard form of quadratic equations. I'm not going to get into that today, but if you start messing around with it a little bit, you can start making this equation look like this equation pretty quickly. But before you're able to do that, so before you're able to actually use that equation, you're going to have to learn how to simplify a radical first. And that's probably something that you haven't done before. All right, so here's the idea behind simplifying a radical. What you want to do is you want to figure out what square root 4 simplifies to. So this one, although this one's a pretty easy one, here's what I want you to do. The square root of 4 is really 2 times 2, right? 2 times 2. 2 times 2 is 4. Now here's what the deal. 2 times 2 is actually 2 squared. So what you're really saying is you're taking the square root of 2 squared, right? Well, when you square a square root, they actually undo each other, right? 2 squared square rooted actually ends up with 2. So I say all that because the square root of 4 is actually just 2. Okay? That's an easy one. Now let's do a harder one. All right. So the square root of 18. Well, what you want to do first is you want to break it down. Well, 18 breaks down to 2 times 3 times 3. Now here's the deal. Every time you have 2 of something, that makes squared. And when you square a square root, they actually just make the number. For example, 3 times 3 is 3 squared. And when you square root 3 squared, you end up with 3. All right, so if I'm going to dumb it down for you, this is all you do. Every time you have 2 of the same thing, you scratch them out, and you write one of them outside the radical. So this is 3 times the square root of 2, or 3 root 2. All right. Pairs, scratch them out, 1 goes outside. Why only 1? Because 3 squared is 9, and when you take the square root of it, it's not 9, it's 3. All right. Let's do 100. Well, 100, break it down. It's 2 times 2 times 5 times 5, right? And like I said before, every time you have a pair, you take 1 out. So you have a pair, we take 1 out of the radical. You have a pair, take 1 out. So what's left inside the radical? Nothing, or 1, and the square root of 1 is 1. So you're left with 2 times 5, which is 10. The square root of 100 is 10. 15, let's try this one. Well, when I break this down, I get 3 times 5, right? Now right here, we have a problem because there is no pairs. So how do I simplify this? I can't is the answer because there are no pairs. So my answer is just square root of 15. Okay? Now the next one, the interesting one, the square root of negative 1. If you look at this and you break it down, negative 1 is really negative 1 times 1, right? They don't have a pair. You can't simplify negative numbers. When you take the square root of a negative number, you actually can't simplify this. In higher level math, this is a very important concept. Algebra 2, when you get to Algebra 2 someday, very soon, you'll be dealing with the square root of negative 1. The square root of negative 1 is really weird because, remember, to do square roots, you had to find 2 numbers that multiply to that number. And the problem with negative 1 is that a negative times a negative is a positive, and a positive times a positive is a positive. There's no way to make negative 1. 2 negatives make a positive, 2 positives make a positive. You'd actually have to have 1 positive and 1 negative, right? Which is actually impossible. So if it's impossible, you have to come up with some new way of doing this. So the square root of negative 1 is a special number, and we call it I. That will not be on your homework tonight, but I thought I'd show it to you here anyways. Okay? Next one, square root of 60. Well, if we do this, it's 2 times 3 is 6, and 2 times 5 is 10, right? So it's 2 times 3 times 2 times 5. And remember what I said before, every time you have a pair, you can take one out. So I have a pair of 2's, take them out. I'm left with a 2 on the outside. What's left on the inside? 3 times 5. So I'm left with 2 times the square root of 15. And that is how you simplify a radical. Okay? Now we'll need that in a few minutes because as you can see here, there's a radical that we're going to have to do some math with. Okay? All right, so let's just go ahead and do a few problems now. All right, example 1. What we want to do is we want our equation to figure out what the a, the b, and the c number are, and then we're just going to plug them into the equation. So let's do that. Well, if I have f of x equals negative x squared plus 3x minus 2, there's a 1 here, right? There's an imaginary 1. So a is a negative 1, b is a 3, and c, be careful, it's not 2, it's negative 2 because you have to look at the entire chunk. So it's negative 2. Okay? Then you just fill in the blanks for the equation. Oops. You just fill in the blanks of the equation. Negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac over 2a. Now this seems complicated, but it's actually not that bad. All right? So let's just fill in the blanks. Negative b means negative 1 times b. So negative 1 times 3 is negative 3. Plus or minus, I'll explain that in a minute, the square root of b squared is 9 minus 4 times what? 4 times a times c, okay, over, using a new tablet today, so it's going to be a little bit messier, over what? Over 2a, that's a mistake, 2a. So 2 times what? Negative 1. Okay? And go ahead and just do the math now. Negative 3 plus or minus the square root of what? Well, let's do this math over here. We have 4 times a negative 1 times a negative 2. So we have negative 1 times negative 2 is 8. I'm sorry, it's 2. And 2 times 4 is 8. So it's 9 minus 8. Get that? This makes 8. 9 minus 8 is 1 over negative 2. All right? All right. Now I am running out of space here, but here's what you're going to do now. All right? What you want to do is once this radical is simplified, and what is the square root of negative 1? I'm sorry, what is the square root of 1? It's actually just 1. So in fact, we could probably be better off writing this just a little bit simpler to make my life a little bit easier right now. So we had negative 3 plus or minus this 9 minus 8 was 1, and the square root of 1 is 1. So we have 3 plus or minus 1 over negative 2. Okay? Now right here is the key. Once I get this radical as simplified as I can, once I get this as simplified as I can, then I just do the two problems. I'm going to have two problems here, and on your paper you should go below it, but up here I'm just going to do it off to the side. I should have negative 3 plus 1 divided by a negative 2, and I should also have negative 3 minus 1 divided by a negative 2. Okay? What I did is I did one time I did the problem with plus 1, and then I did it again with minus 1. Because remember, we want two answers because it's a quadratic, and remember quadratics across the x-axis typically twice. Okay? So let's do this problem. Negative 3 plus 1 is negative 2, and negative 2 divided by negative 2 is what? 1. So one of my answers is 1, and then I do the other one. Negative 3 minus 1 is negative 4, and negative 4 divided by negative 2 is 2. So my answers is 1 and 2, and the best way to write that is 1 and 2. There's my two answers. Pretty simple, right? And you could verify this. I'm going to show you, give me a second here. I'm going to show you this on a graphing calculator. All right. If I was to graph that, if I was to graph this equation, what was it? Negative x plus, oh, not negative x, what, squared, plus 3x, minus, and I don't even remember what it was anymore, minus 2. And I was to graph that, I can see that the two places that this graph crosses the x-axis is at 1 and 2, which is exactly what I'm saying here. Sorry, exactly what I'm saying here. It crosses at 1 and 2, and this crosses at 1 and 2. Same exact thing. Okay? And that's all we're doing here. We're just doing that over and over again. There's a bunch of examples here, and I'm probably not going to do them all with you. But let's do a couple more just so you can understand it. All right, example 3. In example 3, first things first is find out what A, B, and C are. Well, A is 3, B is 8, C is 4. All right? So I'm just going to fill in the blanks, and I'm going to did it again. I'm going to do negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac over 2a. Okay. Fill in the blanks. What do we have? We have negative times b is negative 8, so we have negative 8 plus or minus the square root. Wow, that is the worst square root ever, but let's fix it. The square root of what? B squared, which is 64, minus 4 times 3 times 4. All of that over 2 times 3. All right? Okay, so let's do the math. 4 times 4 is 16. 16 times 3, 30, 48. Right, so this makes 48. So 64 minus 48. I didn't mention this on the last problem, but you can use a calculator to do this math today. I don't mind at all. So 64 minus 48 is 16. All right, so I'm taking the square root of 16. So what I end up with here is negative 8 plus or minus the square root of 16, right? This becomes 16. You can do that on a calculator. And the square root of 16 is 4. So we get negative 8 plus or minus 4 over 6. Then what do? We break it off into two problems. So we get negative 8 plus 4 over 6 and negative 8 minus 4 over 6. Negative 8 plus 4 is negative 4, right? So we get negative 4 over 6. And we get negative 12 over 6. So my two answers are negative 2/3 and negative 2. What am I saying? I'm saying if I graph this equation right here, when I graphed it, the two places it would cross the x-axis is negative 2/3 and negative 2. And we can verify that on a graphing calculator. So let's try that real quick. What do we have? 3, 8, and 4, right? 3, 8, and 4. All right, so I just type in 3, 8, and 4. So 3x squared plus 8x plus 4. Graph that. And I can see that one of the places it crosses the x-axis is at around negative 2/3, and the other one is definitely negative 2. All right? Negative 2/3 and negative 2. That's all there is to it. All right? All right, we're going to do one more example, so we're going to skip around a little bit. We don't need to do a ton of these. So let's go down to example 6. All right? In example 6, first figure out what A, B, and C are. A is 10. B is negative 35, and C is 15, right? Do the quadratic equation. B squared. Ugh, how many times are you going to do this? The equation says negative B plus or minus the square root of B squared minus 4AC. All of that over 2A. Fill in the blanks. Negative of a negative 35 is 35, plus or minus the square root of what? Square root of B squared is what? Well, be careful here, and I do want to talk about this real quick. Do not type it in like this. And earlier in the year, I've talked about this. If you type that on your calculator, you're going to get it wrong, and I need to show you that real quick. So if I pull up a calculator, and I type in negative 35 squared, well, I should get 1225, but I get negative 1225. If I type it in this way, I get positive 1225. And the reason that's happening is because it's following order of operations, so it's actually going to square 35 first and then negatize it, multiply by negative 1 last. So be careful with that. Make sure that negative is in parentheses if you're squaring it, okay? So that's what I need to do here, is that negative 35 obviously needs to be in a parentheses. Minus 4 times 10 times 15. All of that over 2 times 10. Do the math. 35 plus or minus. What I need to do is figure out what 35 squared minus 4 times 10 times 15 is. So 35 squared minus 4 times 10. So I get 1225, right? We already said that from a minute ago. So 1225 minus 4 times, what did we say? 4 times 10 times 15. So 4 times 10 times 15 gives me 625, and then I need to take the square root of that, and I get 25. So that whole thing becomes 25. All right, so I get 35 plus or minus 25 over 10. So what do I do now? I break it off into two problems, first with the plus and then with the minus. So I get 35 plus 25 over 10, and I get 35 minus 25 over 10. Well, 35 plus 25 is 60 over 10 is 6, so one of my answers is 6. And 35 minus 25 is 10, and 10 divided by 10 is 1. So my two answers are 6 and 1. Okay? So there you have it. This is not that hard, and like I said, it's a last resort kind of thing. You don't want to use this unless you absolutely have to, but it does work, and it's not too hard, so good luck with it.